An early look at the free agent guard market shows the Jets got their offseason off on the right foot. That and more today on Locked On Jets.
You are Locked On Jets, your daily New York Jets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome. This is the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. It's Thursday, March 7th, 2024, and I'm your host, John B. from GanggreenNation.com. Thank you so much for making the show your first listen or first watch every day. Subscribe to the show for free on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts, so you'll get new episodes as soon as they're posted. If you enjoy the show and are listening on the podcast source, please give it a 5-star review. And if you're watching on YouTube and enjoy the show, give this episode a big thumbs up. It helps us out and helps other Jets fans find the podcast. Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Make every moment more. Right now, new customers get $150 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. That's $150 if your bet wins. Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon to get started. Well, today we're looking forward to the offseason. The offseason gets kicked off next week. Monday at noon Eastern, the legal tampering period begins. There have been a couple developments in the NFL, some re-signings, some rumors that involve the New York Jets. We're going to touch on some of them on today's episode. And I'm going to begin the show by talking about the guard position, because there was a development, only indirectly impacts the Jets, but it kind of shows you where the market's going to be at the guard position this offseason. Jacksonville has re-signed guard Ezra Cleveland, who they acquired around the trade deadline from Minnesota. Cleveland's a solid guard. There was talk, maybe should the Jets have made a deal for him around the trade deadline. Cleveland, again, a guy who's been a good guard during his career. He signs with the Jaguars as a 3-year deal worth $28.5 million. So an average annual salary around $9.5 million per year. That might be a good barometer about where the guard position is heading this offseason. $9.5 million a year. That's not a small amount, but it's less than you'd pay for like a tackle or a wide receiver. And this takes me back, not that far till when the Jets cut Laken Tomlinson. And by doing so, they saved just around $8 million against the salary cap. And I think the Cleveland re-signing in many ways kind of like shows you the Jets' mindset when they cut Tomlinson. Now, I think there was a lot of analysis that's not really accurate around the Tomlinson cut, because I think a lot of people, what they said was, oh, the Jets cleared up $8 million in cap space. They have so much cap space to spend now. Well, the thing you have to remember about that is by cutting Tomlinson, they created a new hole. Yes, you get the $8 million in cap space, but you also now need a left guard. You need to find a replacement on the offensive line, a starter. And a lot of that $8 million is going to go towards finding that replacement. And the fact that Cleveland made $9.5 million, on his contract shows that to get a decent guy, you're probably going to have to spend most, if not all, that $8 million to find the replacement for Tomlinson. And that's, you can backload the deals to a certain extent. You don't need the big cap hits to come year one. You don't need to spread the cap hits equally. You can have a small year one cap hit and then higher cap hits years 2 and 3 if you assign a guy to a 3-year contract. But it shows you, the idea that the Jets' financial situation changed drastically by cutting Laken Tomlinson was not true. What it shows you, though, it shows you the price of a guard. And the price of the guard is going to be right around what the Jets were going to pay Laken Tomlinson, or at least not what they were going to pay him, but the amount of savings that they got. So essentially, Laken Tomlinson's replacement should pay for himself, because you can use the money that you use to cut Laken Tomlinson to get a replacement. And it shows you that a pretty good guard can be had for the amount that the Jets are saving. And, I've heard some people say, well, should they have cut Tomlinson before a replacement was in place? Well, first of all, what I'd say to that is Laken Tomlinson was really bad. Laken Tomlinson was not an effective player last season. So, I don't know that the Jets have necessarily put themselves in a bad spot by not having Laken Tomlinson. In fact, I'd go as far as to say if Tomlinson was still here, it would be a bad move. But, if you take it a step further, it's reasonable to find a much better player for the amount you saved by cutting Laken Tomlinson. And I think that shows you why this was a good move. The Jets have spent like the last year doing nothing but antagonizing me through moves that I don't like. Finally, they found a move that made sense. And the reason it makes sense, again, is because the guy you should be able to use that money to find a guy who's going to be much better than Laken Tomlinson was for you. And if you look at the guard market in free agency, there are spots where it's going to be tough to find players. But guard, there are a lot of really solid players who are about to hit the market. You have Kevin Dotson of the Rams. You have Robert Hunt of Miami. Kevin Zeitler's a little bit older, Baltimore, but a guy who's been a solid player through much of his career. You could go with Jonah Jackson of the Lions. You could go with John Runyon. I mentioned him yesterday as kind of a fallback option. Guy familiar with Aaron Rodgers, a guy not going to destroy you. A guy who's a pretty decent pass blocker. John Runyon, son of a really good former tackle in the NFL by the same name. So lots of options available at the guard position, and this kind of leads you into some other areas because it's going to be easier to find guards than it will be to find tackles. We've gone through the tackles, and there's lots of flawed options for the New York Jets this offseason. The big two names you hear are Bakhtiari, which, I say it every day, and I'm going to keep saying it until the Jets don't sign him. It's an awful idea to bring in David Bakhtiari. Tyron Smith of Dallas, I think, is not as bad of an idea, but I think he's too risky. He's a guy who's really struggled to stay on the field. He hasn't played a full season. By full season, I mean he hasn't played a full season without missing a game since 2015. And he's missed a lot of time the last 3-4 years. It's tough. It's going to be tougher to find tackles because the pickings are slim. And ultimately, guys who are good tackles don't hit free agency. Their team re-signs them. There's a reason that the options are so shaky at the tackle position. Tackle is viewed as a premium position in this league. Guard is not. And I think that will have a lot to do with the way the Jets handle Elijah Vera Tucker. Now, I'm going to be honest with you. I prefer AVT at guard. The more I think about this, the more I feel like AVT belongs at guard. In part, the Jets evaluated him as a guard. And part of it's, he doesn't really have long arms. So if you don't have long arms, to play tackle effectively, you really have to rely on your athleticism. Because essentially you need to get in front of guys before you're going to have a tough time, making first contact, getting that first punch on them if you have shorter arms. The only way to do it is just beat them to the spots and use your athleticism. Well, AVT's coming off an Achilles injury. And in any event, I think he's better guard than he is tackle. I mean, the last couple of years, he's held up fine grading on the curve of a guy who's playing tackle in an emergency situation. He's held up okay. But I think in the long run, he's going to be a better guard than he will be a tackle. However, I don't know that the Jets are necessarily focused on what's best for AVT's development. I think the Jets are focused on how do they fill their holes this offseason. And I think that, if you look at it, it's going to be easier to find guards because I named a number of guys who are very solid players who figured to hit the market. Now, some of them may re-sign with their current team, like Cleveland did before the legal tampering period begins. But at the end of the day, there's going to be a decent number of guards, and guards are cheaper than tackles. And, the other thing I'd say is I've also been saying I kind of prefer Joe Tippmann at guard. Well, it might be easier to find a guard than it is to find a center this year. And Tippmann's at least natural position is center. So I understand the arguments for keeping Pittman at center. The Jets drafted him to be the center, and he's got a lot of athleticism. Yeah, he brings new things to the table because of his athleticism, because of his movement skills. He can block guys further down the field. He'll be able to be pulled on plays. He'll add something to your run game because he'll hit blocks that centers can't usually hit. He'll be able to block guys. He'll be able to get further down the field than your typical center. So he at least adds some things to the playbook as far as his blocking goes. But, if you're looking at the Jets, the easiest path this offseason, I don't think it's the best path for them, but I think the path of least resistance might be focusing at guard because, if Ezra Cleveland set the market, and I don't know if set the market's the right term because I don't think he's going to be the top guard available. I don't know that he's going to be the most expensive guard, but kind of gives you the idea of what it's going to cost to get a decent guard. And, it's not that much relative to what it's going to cost to get a tackle. And the good news for the Jets is the Cleveland contract kind of shows you that Laken Tomlinson money, that's just about going to pay for his replacement. And that replacement is probably going to be better than Laken Tomlinson. Now, of course, another spot where the Jets are looking for upgrades is wide receiver. As we continue on this Thursday edition of Locked On Jets, a new rumored player has entered the discussion around the Jets. We'll talk about who that is and how he may fit ahead here on this Thursday edition of Locked On Jets. Today's episode of Locked On Jets is brought to you by eBay Motors. Passion, drive, and patience. What brings home the winning trophy is also what keeps your ride or die alive. eBay Motors has everything you need to maintain your vehicle and level it up to peak performance. From superchargers, roof racks, exhaust kits, LED headlights, and more, whether you're into speed, power, or style, eBay Motors has got you covered. And with over 122 million parts for your number one ride or die, you'll always find exactly what you're looking for. And with eBay Guaranteed Fit, your part is guaranteed to fit your ride every time or your money back. Because with eBay Motors, you're burning rubber, not cash. With all the parts you need at the prices you want, it's easy to turn your car into the MVP and bring home that win. Keep your ride or die alive at ebaymotors.com. Eligible items only, exclusions apply. eBay guaranteed fit, only available to U.S. customers. Today's episode of Locked On Jets is brought to you by Game Time. You know you should not have to worry when you buy tickets to the next big event. Game Time is the fast and easy way to buy tickets for all the sports, music, comedy, and theater events near you. With killer last-minute deals, all-in prices, views from your seat, and their best price guarantee, Game Time takes the guesswork out of buying tickets. You can see the view from your seat before you buy, so you know exactly what to expect when you arrive. All-in prices show you your total up front, so you know you're getting a great deal before you check out. Buy tickets in seconds with just 2 taps. I've used Game Time myself. Incredibly easy to use. You don't really have to jump through a lot of hurdles. You find great seats. You're going to get the view from your seat, so there's no surprises when you arrive. Makes life so easy, and you get your tickets in plenty of time for your event. And right now, you can take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Game Time. You download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDON for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDON, locked on. It's one word with no space for $20 off. Download Game Time today. Last minute tickets, lowest price, guaranteed. Thank you so much for making Locked On Jets your first listener, first watch every day. Big shout out to you every dayers. This is a daily podcast covering the New York Jets. We have new episodes each day through the week, Monday through Friday, bonus episodes as needed. We keep moving closer to the offseason. Legal tampering period gets underway on Monday. Lots of speculation about offensive linemen the Jets could bring in. Lots of speculation about wide receivers the Jets could bring in. A new name kind of entered the mix earlier this week. Albert Breer mentioned a name that hasn't really been discussed much around Jets circles, and that's Cincinnati Bengals wide receiver Tyler Boyd. A really solid receiver, a guy who in many ways was like an overqualified number 3 receiver, or has been through the last couple of years. And the Bengals had probably the best receiver room in the NFL over the last couple of years, because they have Jamar Chase, who's an elite level number 1 receiver. They have T. Higgins, who's an overqualified number 2 receiver, a number 2 receiver who'd be the number 1 receiver on a lot of teams. And then Tyler Boyd, who's an overqualified number 3 receiver. He's a number 3 receiver who'd be the number 2 receiver on a number of teams. Of course, we know that the Jets are going to desperately focus on upgrading the wide receiver position, because after Garrett Wilson, I mean, what do you have? Lazard, David Gibson, Jason Brownlee. I mean, if any of these guys is playing a big role for the Jets in 2024, I think the front office has not done its job. But there is not a lot of great quality options available to the Jets. And they keep, more keep going off the board. And it seems like every day, we lost the option of Mike Evans. Higgins himself is, it got the franchise tag. There just really aren't a lot of high-end options. Calvin Ridley is really the one guy who's like profiles as like a number 1 type receiver. But even then, like, I don't think he's like an alpha number 1. I think he's more of like lower tier number 1 guy, and he's going to have a lot of interest. I think his contract is going to be much higher than people expect. I think for the Jets, Calvin Ridley, if it's under $20 million, it's a deal that makes a lot of sense for them. But I think the more you get past $20 million, the more you wonder whether Calvin Ridley is going to be worth the money. So instead of finding like the high-end option to pair with Garrett, maybe you find a couple of second-tier option guys. And Tyler Boyd could be one of them. And Cincinnati actually has a fair amount of cap space, but they need to get T. Higgins under contract. They also have to worry about Jamar Chase's contract, in the future. So the Bengals have to go through a lot. Boyd might be the kind of guy you let go. In the NFL, managing your cap effectively sometimes means prioritizing. The guys who are your cornerstone, your star level players, you keep them, and you have to let go of the guys who are good but not great. And that's where a guy like Tyler Boyd could hit the open market. Now, Boyd would be an interesting option because he's primarily been a slot receiver in Cincinnati. If you look through the numbers, he's lined up in the slot the last couple of years over 80% of the time. So he'd be a full-time slot guy. And what's interesting is that, last year Nathaniel Hackett really focused on little guys in the slot. You saw a lot of Randall Cobb in the slot. You saw Xavier Gibson. Occasionally he'd flex his one of the tight ends into the slot, but the slot was really focused on the smaller, almost like the guys you view as prototypical slot receivers. Whereas in the NFL these days, many of the slot receivers are becoming bigger. Part of the reason you're seeing this rise to the big slot position is the slot receiver does tend to have a role in run block because he's in the middle of the field. Now, I don't want to overstate it. I think sometimes people get carried away by talking about how important a wide receiver is to your team's run blocking. Very few wide receivers, if any, actually play a big role. In fact, I feel like when you hear somebody talk about, oh, this receiver was so important to our run blocking, it's a guy like Alan Lazard where he offers so little as a receiver that you just have to like try and invent a way to make him sound more valuable than he really is. But although Boyd has not been, Boyd's been kind of up and down as a blocker through the years. He's 6'2", 203 pounds, so not a small guy. Not a guy you think of as like a typical kind of slot receiver. So maybe he could help in that respect. But more than anything, you're just looking for more production out of the wide receiver position. And I mentioned this yesterday, but it's not a great spot to be in, where the Jets are, with Garrett Wilson and really nothing behind him. The one benefit to it is that you can sign practically anybody and there'll be an upgrade. It's not that hard to upgrade the spot at the wide receiver right now for the Jets after Garrett. And Boyd's been a guy who's been just a really summer through his career. He actually has a couple 1,000-yard seasons to his name. He was a 1,000-yard guy in 2018 and 2019. And then as the Bengals added their great young receiver duo and Joe Burrow and Jamar Chase, he kind of slid into more of a support role. Now, a little bit of a red flag is that his production went down this past season. 67 catches, only 667 yards. And that's always a little bit of a warning sign because he's on the verge of turning 30. So that's always a little bit concerning. He'll turn 30 on November 15th. So it'll be, second half of the season, he'll hit the big 3-0. And that's always a mark that tends to have danger in the NFL. But there's a caveat here. And I think if you followed the Bengals, you probably know what I'm about to say. And this would make me feel a little bit easier about Tyler Boyd's decline in production this year. Bengals quarterback situation was not great. Joe Burrow played much of the season injured and then went down. So Jake Browning started a lot of games. And no disrespect to Jake Browning, who actually had a couple of really solid games in there, but Bengals did not have like the full slate at quarterback this year. They did not have the great Joe Burrow playing for them the entire season the way they typically do. So I think you could probably point to that as a very, very big contributing factor to Tyler Boyd's decreased production. And why do I say that? Well, in part because T. Higgins' numbers also went down. T. Higgins' numbers went down by more than Boyd's did. I certainly would not be afraid for the Jets to go after T. Higgins. So while there's always a warning sign. I think what you have to do is you have to find the warning signs. You don't completely dismiss them, but you try and find out like what are the odds that this is part of the problem. I don't think you could say like Boyd getting up there, his late 20s, about to turn 30, that there's zero risk when your production goes down. But I think there are contributing factors. Right? I think mitigating circumstances, such as what I just mentioned, the quarterback situation got worse this past season. So he'd be an interesting option. I don't think the Jets could just sign Tyler Boyd and be done at the wide receiver position. See, like if they signed Ridley, I'd say, it doesn't really matter what else they do. Yeah, you'd like to add other guys, but Ridley's going to cost so much money. Second of all, though, he's going to add so much that the number 3 wide receiver is not as significant. Now, you want to do better than Xavier Gibson, certainly, but the number 3 wide receiver doesn't need to be as good. Whereas if you don't get Ridley, you're going to have to find a number 2 and a number 3 receiver who are both pretty good. And I feel like Tyler Boyd could be like half of that equation. I think they'd have to get somebody else, whether it's through the draft, whether it's in free agency. But Tyler Boyd, that could be an interesting option. Also, talking about options, let's move our attention to the safety position as we continue here on this Thursday edition of Locked On Jets. That's what we're going to talk about. Defense is the stronger of the 2 units on the Jets. Safety is not necessarily the most glaring need, but it's probably the weakest part on the defense. Fortunately for the Jets, it's shaping up to be a buyer's market at the position, and we'll go into more detail on that as we continue this Thursday edition of Locked On Jets. This episode of Locked On Jets is brought to you by Robinhood. Did you know that even if you have a 401k for retirement, you can still have an IRA? Robinhood has the only IRA that gives you a 3% boost on every dollar you contribute. Subscribe to Robinhood Gold. But get this. Now through April 30th, Robinhood is even boosting every single dollar you transfer in from other retirement accounts with a 3% match. That's right, no cap on the 3% match. Robinhood Gold gets you the most for your retirement thanks to their IRA with a 3% match. This offer is good through April 30th. Get started at robinhood.com/boost. Subscription fees apply. And now for some legal info. Claim as of Q1 2024. Validated by Radius Global Market Research. Investing involves risk, including loss. Limitations apply to IRAs and 401ks. 3% match requires Robinhood Gold for 1 year from the date of the first 3% match. Must keep Robinhood IRA for 5 years. The 3% matching on transfers is subject to specific terms and conditions. Robinhood IRA available to U.S. customers in good standing. Robinhood Financial, LLC, member SIPC, is a registered broker-dealer. This is the Locked On Jets podcast here on this Thursday. Let's turn our attention to the safety position. For the New York Jets, it might be the weakest spot on the defense, and that's not really saying a whole lot because the defense is really strong. And I don't think the Jets got great safety play in 2023, but their defense was still really good. The safety play did not really hurt the New York Jets, but you always try and upgrade your roster. And the safety free agent class is now starting to look very strong. Today, the Broncos news broke that the Broncos are cutting safety Justin Simmons, an excellent player. Yesterday, word came out that the Bills were releasing Jordan Poyer. There are also lots of really, really good safeties available in free agency, and that's a positive for a team like the New York Jets. And the reason it's a positive is, well, first of all, the Jets don't have a lot of money to spend. And because of that, they need to focus on their core needs. They need to focus on offensive line and wide receiver with their cap space. So they don't have a lot of money to spend at the safety position. But basic laws of economics, when supply is high, prices go down. Now, I'm not saying the Jets should be at the top, buying at the top of the market at the safety position. I'm not saying they should go out and get Hyde. I'm not saying they should go out and get Simmons. In fact, I don't think these guys would be good values for the Jets because there are teams out there like the Philadelphia Eagles that desperately need help at the safety position. Whose defense fell apart last year in part because of what happened at the safety position. The Jets' defense was good despite having issues at safety. And I think we know safety is not really a super high value position. Listen, if you have a great safety, that's better than having bad safeties. But for a Jets team that's great on the defensive line, that's great at corner, adding a great safety just doesn't have the same impact. You can get by with what you had at safety. You can get by with re-signing Chuck Clark probably. Tony Adams, I'm not the biggest Tony Adams guy in the world, but you know who Tony Adams reminds me a bit of? And even though they play different positions, but he reminds me a little bit of Quincy Williams the first couple of years, because the first couple of years Quincy Williams was with the Jets. Jets kept talking him up. And you may remember, I did not believe the Jets when they said this. Jets kept saying, we believe Quincy Williams has Pro Bowl potential. I'm like, oh, yeah, sure, Jets. Go. That's great. Well, Quincy Williams did have Pro Bowl potential. There were moments during the first couple of years, though, where he played kind of out of control, where he overran plays, but he also made big plays. And that's what Tony Adams reminded me of last year. When Tony Adams was part of some big plays, most notably that huge interception on Jalen Hurts late in the fourth quarter of the Jets comeback win over the Eagles. Also times where he ran himself out of plays like Quincy did earlier in his career. So I'm inclined to actually give the Jets the benefit of the doubt when they talk about Tony Adams because they keep talking him up. His play has not really justified their talk yet, but we've been through this before. So maybe there's something there in Tony Adams. But even if there's not, the Jets got by pretty well with Adams and Whitehead. And again, I'd rather have good safeties than bad safeties. But in an offseason where you don't have much money to spend and you have a lot you have to fix, especially on the offensive side of the ball, you can't really afford to throw a ton of money at the safety position. The good news, though, is that because there are so many quality safeties who are hitting the market, again, there's probably going to be somebody really good who's going to settle for a cheap deal that's a couple $1 million, or maybe a deal that's even the league minimum. I think the Jets can get their offseason off on the right foot by bringing back Chuck Clark for cheap, bringing back Ashton Davis for cheap, even though Davis, I view Davis as more of like a linebacker than I do a safety and as far as the role he plays with the Jets, even though they technically list him as a safety. But ultimately, there's going to be some good players available who are not going to go for much money. So if you only have to spend a couple $1 million, again, you'd rather be good than bad at safety. And there are going to be guys, difficult to say how the market's going to play out. You don't really know the guys who the market's going to fall out on. And some of it has to do with the way these players manage free agency. There are certain guys every year who kind of mismanage things. Their agents overplay their hand. They ask for too much money. And then teams just find other options. Suddenly they don't have a team to play for and they end up settling for a cheap 1-year deal. So this is going to be an opportunity for the Jets. And safety is just not really viewed as a high value position in this league. There just aren't a lot of difference makers. And I think part of it's just like the difference between a good safety and a safety who's just kind of okay. It doesn't really move the needle on your defense. A great safety a great player at any position will move the needle. A great safety will change your defense, but there just aren't many of them. And again, the difference between a guy who's really good and a guy who's just average, it doesn't typically have that big of an impact on your defense. And that goes double for a Jets defense where they're so good at the premium spots that upgrading the safety won't make that big of a difference. But if you're not paying a lot for it, it looks like the Jets may not end up needing to pay a lot to upgrade their safety position. It's a benefit. So it's kind of one area where things might be lining up for the New York Jets this offseason, where they can maybe upgrade the weakest part of the defense without compromising their ability at all to upgrade their offense. Because again, you're not going to be paying much. You got to pay somebody at safety. Somebody's got to play safety. So you're going to have to find somebody. And in any event, safety is always one of those. Safety is always like the spot where there's always there's only like one or two guys who don't get signed till like May or June and end up settling for like the league minimum. So in a normal year, it's not that hard to find a quality safety. But this year, with so much quality hitting the market, I mean, if you look through the list of names, a lot of really big names, a lot of really good players. They're going to push down some of the more average guys. And I think there's good Jets are going to be able to find a good value at that position, which is a positive thing for the team. Anyway, that's all for today's episode. This has been the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day is our motto. As always, if you enjoy the show, hit the subscribe button where you're watching or listening so that you'll never miss an episode. If you enjoy the show and are listening on a podcast source, please give it a 5-star review. And if you're watching on YouTube and enjoy the show, give this episode a big thumbs up. It helps us out, helps other Jets fans find the podcast. Have a great Thursday, everybody. We'll be back tomorrow to close out the week.